Hey, so today we're going to go ahead and get started with Frindle. There's Frindle. And we are starting with chapter 5, which is entitled The Report. So today's reading is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to read the first portion of chapter 5, and then I'm going to stop. Wherever I stop, it is then your responsibility to pick up your reading the rest of chapter 5 and chapter 6 in order to be able to answer your questions. So we're going to go ahead and get started with chapter 5, The Report, on page 22. By lunchtime the next day, Nick had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. Seventh period was coming. He was going to have to stand up in front of Mrs. Granger's class. The eyes of everyone in the class would be glued to his face, and Mrs. Granger's eyes would be cranked up to maximum punch power. He looked over his notes again and again. The first English dictionary, the growth of the English language, William Shakespeare, words from French and German, new words, old words, new inventions, Anglo-Saxon words, Latin and Greek roots, American English. In all, it all became a big jumble in his mind. And his grand plan from the night before, in the harsh fluorescent light of the school day, it seemed impossible. What is it with clocks in school? When you're planning to go to the carnival after school, the clocks in every class practically run backward. The school day lasts for about 3 weeks, but if you're planning to go to the barber or shopping for clothes after school, zip, the whole day is over before you can blink. And today, after lunch, periods 5 and 6 went by in 2 ticks. As the seventh period bell rang, Mrs. Granger walked into the classroom, took 4 steps from her desk at the side of the room, flipped open the attendance book, glanced out at the class, and made 2 little check marks. Then, looking up at Nick, she said, "I think you have a little report to begin our class today, Nicholas." 15 seconds into seventh period, and Nick was on stage. "This lady plays for keeps," thought Nick. He gulped, grabbed his crumpled note cards and his book bag, and walked to the front of the room. He stood next to the giant dictionary on its little table, and Mrs. Granger walked to the back of the classroom and sat primly on a tall stool next to the bookcases. She was wearing her blue uniform. Taking a deep breath, Nick began. "Well, the first thing I learned is that the first English dictionary," Mrs. Granger interrupted. "Excuse me, Nicholas, but does your report have a title?" Nick looked blankly at her. "A title? No, I didn't make a title." "Class, please remember to introduce a title whenever you prepare a written or oral report. Now, please go on, Nicholas." She smiled and nodded at him. Nick began again. Looking right at Mrs. Granger, he said, "The dictionary." A couple of kids thought that was funny, but Nick played it straight and just kept talking. "A lot of people think that the first English dictionary was put together in the 1700s by a man named Samuel Johnson. He lived in London, England. He was real smart, and he wrote a lot of books, and smart he wanted all the other smart people to have a good dictionary to use, so he made one. But there were other dictionaries before his. The thing that was different about Johnson's dictionary was its size. First of all, he had over 43,000 words in it. The class made a bunch of noise at the big number. Ooh and wow and stuff like that. And Nicholas lost his concentration. He glanced up at Mrs. Granger, expecting to see those eyes drilling a hole in him, but they weren't. They were almost friendly in a teachery kind of way. She shushed the class and said, "Go on, Nicholas. That's a fine beginning." Nick almost smiled, but he saw all the kids staring at him. So he gripped his note cards even tighter and jumped back in. The other thing that Samuel Johnson did that was special was to choose the words he thought were most important, and then give lots of examples showing how the words got used by people. For example, he showed how the word take could be used in 113 different ways. Nick's report went on smoothly for 12 minutes. He was surprised at how easy it was to stand there and talk about stuff. At the end of the first 5 minutes, Mrs. Granger had to stop Nick and say, "Class, it is not good manners to yawn out loud or put your heads down on your desk when someone is giving an oral report." No one in the class cared one bit about the report except for Mrs. Granger. Every time Nick glanced up, she was smiling, and her eyes were not the least bit icy or sharp. She was eating this stuff up, listening and nodding, and every once in a while she would say, "Very good point," and "Yes, that's exactly right." But the next time Nick looked up, he saw Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. 18 minutes gone. Maybe his idea it was going to work after all. Time for phase two. Reaching into his book bag, Nick pulled out the red dictionary he had brought from home, the one most of the kids had, the one Mrs. Granger said they should use. Nick said, "This is the dictionary that I use at home for my vocabulary work. And and I opened it up last night to the very front. And right there I found out a lot about how the dictionary was made right in this book. So I thought some of the ideas would be good as a part of my report. It says here, Nicholas." Nick looked up. Mrs. Granger got off her tall stool, and its wooden legs made a screech on the linoleum. Heads snapped to attention and the class was alert again. Mrs. Granger smiled, raised her eyebrows, and pointed at her watch. "Nicholas, I think the class should read that at home themselves." Now, John's hand was up in the air and Mrs. Granger nodded at him. "But I don't have that dictionary at home." "Mrs. Granger, I have a blue one." And several other kids immediately said, "Me too." Mrs. Granger tried not to show that she was annoyed. "Well, very well, Nick, but it shouldn't take too long. We have other things to do today." Nick kept his eyes wide and nodded. He adjusted his glasses on his nose and began to read. So we're stopping there on page 27, and we're going to go ahead and look at our questions. Question number one says, which detail from the text explain why Mrs. Granger was becoming annoyed? So just where we recently left off on page 27, it said that Mrs. Granger tried not to show that she was annoyed. So I'm looking to see, well, what happened right before then that would have possibly made Mrs. Granger annoyed? So I look at the bottom of page 26. Nick looked up. Mrs. Granger had gotten off of that tall stool, and the wooden legs made a screech on the linoleum, the floor. Head snapped to attention, and the class was back at alert. Mrs. Granger smiled, her eyebrows um, raised and pointed at her watch, so she's thinking about the time. And she says, "Nicholas, I think the class should read that at home themselves." And then shortly after that, John raises his hand. "Well, I don't have that dictionary at home. I have a blue one." And then the other kids are doing that. So here it is. What is Nick trying to do? Think about what we read in the previous chapters. He has the question stopper, right? So here he's just trying to waste class time, but he's doing it in a different way. And so I think Mrs. Granger is saying, okay, we've been on this 18 minutes And now you all want to be all interested into this dictionary. So let's look at our answer choices. A, Nick was surprised at how easy it was to talk about this stuff. So that's telling me about Nick's feelings. We are focusing on Mrs. Granger and her becoming annoyed. B, I think the class should read that at home themselves. So read that, which is the first part of the dictionary where he's trying to go into phase 2 of his report to extend it out. She's saying, hold up, I think we should do that later at home. And then shortly after, it talks about her being annoyed. So that's a good possibility. Let's keep going. C, that this is the dictionary I use at home. Well, the dictionary I use at home is referring to Nick, right? So again, we're focusing on Mrs. Granger and her feelings. And D, Mrs. Granger took a sneak at her watch. So yes, she did take a sneak at her watch, but she wasn't quite annoyed then. She became annoyed during the section where it's talking about, hold up, we're going to stop this because the kids can read that at home, but then the other kids start chiming in. So our best answer choice is that Mrs. Granger was saying that I think the other kids can read this at home. Let's look at number 2. Which actions show that Nick was pleased with his report? So I'm looking to see where it shows that Nick might have some happiness going on about what's going on. So if we look on page 26 at that first paragraph, he kept looking back up, right, at Mrs. Granger to see her reaction to what was happening. He did say it was easy for him to talk about it. He kind of wanted to smile a couple of times, but he held back. It says that he took a, had a, by the next time Nick looked up, second paragraph, he saw Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. 18 minutes had gone. Maybe his idea was going to work after all. 18 minutes of the class have gone by. That's like almost all of recess. And all of that time has gone by. He is trying to kick it up. He says now it's time for phase 2. So phase 1, he was kind of actually doing a report. Phase 2, he's pulling out a dictionary and getting ready to try to read from the front. So he's thinking that, hey, things are moving just the way I want them to. So let's look at our answer choices. Number 2 says, what is the actions? Answer choice A says A, that Nick looked at her blankly. B, maybe his idea was going to work. C, class, it is not good manners to yawn out loud. That statement was made by Mrs. Granger and not by Nick. D, he gripped his note cards even tighter. That was at the beginning where he was feeling kind of nervous. So here I have A and B. He looked at her blankly. He's trying to pretend like he doesn't know what's going on. But B is going to be my best answer choice because he's feeling a little bit more confident because he thinks, hey, this right here is actually going to work. So your job is to make sure you fill in those 2 answer choices, and you are starting on page 27 of chapter 5, where it says Nick kept his eyes open. Read the remainder of chapter 5 and all of chapter 6 in order to answer your questions.